Stephen Carson coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri, in these United States. We've got Black Horse back with us in just a moment. And otherwise, I'll just say that my subscribers have been especially appreciated as we come up to Christmas, covering things, helping me out. And that support is gratefully received at Subscribestar. You can find that in the video description on YouTube, in case you're watching on Twitter, which we think people watch us on Twitter. I don't know. We keep shooting stuff to Twitter. All right. So, oops. There we go. Okay. Hi, Black Horse. Welcome back.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
All is well with the family, right?
Yes, mom and baby doing well. Good.
And siblings are happy to have a new one, right?
Yeah. And my 7-year-old is, she's delighting in being a student mother. Let's put it that way.
Oh, wow. That sounds fun.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's see. Yeah, so we're going to start with something that I guess you could say is a little bit more anecdotal, but I want to ask you something, broad question here, which I'm sure a lot of us puzzle over, which is that sometimes it seems like the anecdotal evidence of our lying eyes is at variance with what we're told the statistics say. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Now, part of that is because, unlike you, most of us don't necessarily dig into those ourselves and get a handle on what the stats are really saying, and we're hearing the spin around the spin on them, right? Where they're cherry picking certain things and, hey, everything's great because we saw like 5 more people get jobs last quarter or something, right? There's various ways to not be honest with the statistics that are out there. But how do you think about it? We're going to talk today about real life human beings feeling economic pinch. But then there are people on Twitter, I see them saying, actually, everything's fine. And it's just, what is it? There was a debate over, is it real or is it vibes or something like that, you know?
Yeah.
So how do you think about that when sort of you sort of are hearing stories and sort of maybe seeing things personally and the stats are telling you something else?
Yeah. I mean, my view is manifold here. First of all, people kind of forget how wealthy and how historically unusually wealthy the middle and lower class was in the West in the period between sort of in the post-war period between sort of 1960 and maybe 2008. And so like it's worth just kind of putting into context the things that the people around you are complaining about. It's pretty historically normal to see people economically struggling to own their own land and food. Like I look at the history of the New World and just masses and masses of people coming out of Europe because of the lure of relatively inexpensive land. So people have had that struggle for, a very, very long time. If you look at the conditions that your great and great great grandparents lived through, economic hardship is a relative term. And I think a lot of the anecdote has to do with people doing worse than their parents did and worse than their grandparents did. And there's the narrative breaking aspect of that, which causes a lot of psychological pain, which is different than kind of an objective measurement. So there's that element to it. The other element to it is that like almost every statistic that you see is architected to tell a story. And so, you just have to be very, very careful, and you have to be prepared for the fact that a lot of those statistics cross pretty broad geographic ranges that are beyond, the scope of what a person is likely to do. So most people live and die within, a couple of hundred, maybe 200 miles of 200 miles for their whole life. So, even if the even if housing prices in the United States are not at historic highs, hypothetically, they might be at historic highs in the 200 miles in which that person lives. Um,
Mhm.
you know,
Yeah.
and so local stories definitely exist, and local stories are where you get anecdotes from.
Right. Yeah. I want to be careful because, I tend to sort of say, hey, we should look at absolute, not relative poverty, for example, right? Um, Kind of like what you're saying, how much is what people are feeling is not that they're really experiencing poverty that would historically be recognized as poverty, but it's relative poverty. So, that is an important perspective to keep grounded. On the other hand, I just want to highlight, and I'll share this thread. I was reading Charles Haywood's latest book review, and there was a lot of great comments in there. But one of the quotes that I shared, the quote I shared first, he said, "Creating rising expectations, then failing to deliver, is the proximate cause of the failure of most regimes." So that's an area, right? That subjective um, estimation, your
Yeah,
subjective expectations, right?
and this
And
is this
and
is what I was getting
subsist
at.
point expectations. That's an area where you might say, yeah, well, relative to this or that, it's not so bad. In a way, that doesn't matter if it comes to people taking action,
Yeah,
right?
well, and that's part of what I was getting at with where people, maybe they're not in poverty in absolute terms, but they're doing worse than their parents and worse than their grandparents. Viewing that as an unfulfilled promise made to them is a really good frame for understanding the suffering that goes with it.
Right. Yes. Yes. And it can. And Charles Haywood's point is, it can have political consequences when people feel disappointed, right?
Yeah,
Um,
can and probably should, right?
yeah. Right. Okay. So um, this has all been kind of going on, but partially inspired by the recent show with Nomad here on this channel, as he just mentioned to me. Morgoth, my friend Morgoth, just had an article, and I just want to. I don't often. I don't know if I have mentioned like a Morgoth article on my stream before. I share them on Twitter all the time, but I would like to share it here and just promote to say that I'm subscribed to. I have a lot of friends who create content. Right, as a content creator, you end up making friends with other content creators. So I'm subscribed to like a gazillion people on Substack. But just to be brutally honest, there's only two where I won't miss a piece that they publish, and one is Academic Agent, and the other is Morgoth. Um, I never miss something he writes, and I'm usually promoting it. um, so here he starts by talking about women crying for help on TikTok, and is that telling us something? And what he's talking about is that he said, here, I'll just read from him. I've noticed gradually, a trend I've noticed gradually increasing is that of the distraught white woman speaking to the camera on her phone, expressing despair about the economic difficulties she's facing. I don't know if I said what I did. I put the link to his this essay in the live chat, so you can grab it from there, the YouTube live chat. He says, I first began noticing the trend of these videos at least 18 months ago, but throughout 2023, the frequency with which I would see them on social media increased dramatically. I'm sure most people know the format now. A woman in her 20s or 30s sits in her car, somewhat disheveled, shouting and crying over the fact that no matter how many hours she works, no matter how drastically she cuts back her expenses, she cannot keep the budgetary wolf from the door. In Britain, we even have terminology now in use to describe this. We call it the cost of living crisis, or the depressingly blunt heat or eat phenomenon.
Oof, oof.
The woman will break down her entire income and outgoings, as well as detail what bills she will face in the coming weeks or months. The conclusion is inevitably that it is untenable. Yeah, so the heat or eat, just in case you're missing what he's getting at there, as we've discussed on this show, we've seen some challenges in Europe in particular to heating your home because of rising cost of natural gas in particular. Now, we were focusing more on the continent because they were getting natural gas from Russia, and then because of sanctions, they stopped doing that. So they saw a spike in their cost of heating. I'm less clear on the UK issue there, but basically to keep heating my home, I end up cutting down on what I eat. Right, that's the heat or eat. Pretty brutal. So. Yeah, and so he says in Britain at the end of 2023, there's a feeling of crisis or emergency, that life has become exponentially more difficult across multiple fronts, but it's not been formalized and made official by the authorities. Yeah, and that's something that I remember Academic Agent pointed out, that if the media was happy with who was running the regime, then they would make happy movies.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
if they were unhappy with who was running the regime, then everything would be pictured like you're in the middle of a depression. So what I think Morgoth's getting at here is we're getting like the happy stuff, but people's lived experience is at variance with what what is being projected back to them that their life is like.
Yeah, you see this constantly in the rhetoric in the U.S. over inflation, where like the Biden administration constantly tries to argue like, yeah, sure, the price of food went up 40% last year, but it didn't go up this year, so congratulations for that, right? But I think this gets at what we were discussing earlier. Like, how do you interpret the anecdotal signal? So
yeah,
you've got this anecdotal signal of
TikTok videos.
Yeah. And so how do you contextualize that? Well, one way to contextualize it is to look at measures of economic stress at the bottom. Because what these TikTok videos typically are about are people moving from like the lower middle class to the underclass. The lower middle class is a group of people who, are able to maintain without social assistance their like a basic lifestyle. And then, the next rung down on the ladder is are these people who like they kind of scrape by because it's actually pretty hard to starve in a Western regime, but they're no longer living independent lives. And I think
they're getting assistance in some form or fashion.
Yeah, probably the best measure of this are food assistance programs. So if you want to figure out how many people are making this transition in the US, you look at the SNAP numbers, how many people are on food stamps. In the UK, there's another proxy, which is the food banks.
I'll pull that up right now.
So I actually think Morgoth is not correct in his assessment that this is like a right now problem. I actually think this is a problem which has built over what you're looking at is a tipping point where a phenomenon that's been going on for quite a long time is becoming more and more difficult to ignore.
Yeah, right.
And so if we look at these food bank numbers, you're looking at like a 100-fold increase over a 15-year period. But
right. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm getting what you were pointing out to me. The first number we have on here from 2008, 2009, coming out of an economic crisis, by the way, right? So it wasn't like those were the happy days.
Yeah.
This is coming out of this is the midst of the 2007, 2008 economic crisis we've covered on the channel. You've got 25,899 people using food banks. And now you're up to nearly 3 million. Right. So that's how many orders of magnitude is that?
It's 2 orders of magnitude.
2 orders of magnitude jump from about 25,000 to over 2.5 million, right? Nearly 3 million. Wow. And I'm glad you got my perspective on this right, because I was real focused on like the last couple of years, and I'm like, oh well, it was up during COVID and it's down, now it's back up again. And your point was, yeah, but look at it over the last 10 years or 15 years.
Yeah,
this is crazy.
Well, and I think this is the story about a lot of the economic stressors in Europe that we've been telling. There are these kind of acute shock moments, like in COVID, where everybody kind of cries out about it because it's a big sort of aesthetic change in the life that they see. But these are
Yeah.
actually the culmination of uh, pretty
Larger
substantial,
trends. Yeah.
long-term trends toward the
Yeah.
degradation of kind of the lower middle class in the UK and probably in Europe more broadly.
Right. Yeah. So there's an expectation of these white British women or whatever, right? And he said after that, he says men too. He sees videos from men as well. There's an expectation of these folks that they were going to be having a certain kind of, I hate the word lifestyle. That makes it sound like lifestyles the rich and famous.
Yeah.
That they were able to live independently, as you said, right? And now they're like, I'm going to need help just to get by.
Yeah.
And that's a bit of a shock.
Yeah, no, it's and it leads to these kinds of, at these unfulfilled expectations. You see them in TikTok videos, but you also see them in like your regular life where people just they have fundamental changes in attitude when they realize that kind of the hope that they had for their own future is not going to be fulfilled one way or the other.
Mm-hmm. Distracted by the spot of sun behind me.
There you go.
Okay, so, oh yeah, and there was one other thing. Back to his article real quick. Let me see if I can find the bit. Oh yeah, so much of the confusion and despair in the country is a manifestation of the British inhabiting an ever lower stratum of the social hierarchy, but in their own country. The further we move down the economic spectrum, the more acute this problem becomes until eventually we end up with something like Rotherham and the grooming scandal, wherein native white girls were neither protected by the authorities nor safeguarded by family structures. So he's talking about you're in the society that is your historic society, right? In the case of Britain, these are, English, Welsh, and Scottish people or whatever, right? And they've been there for a really long time. And they're increasingly feeling like they are on the outside of their own society, not able to get the help and protection that they would have expected as, natives of that land, right? And that's one of the things this article really left me with, that sense of you feel like you should be, your expectation is you would be on the inside, but you find that in practice you're on the outside.
Yeah, and I think that comes down to the difference between the kind of what you might call the gated official narrative. The gated official narrative of Britain is not that it's a country that's becoming impoverished, right? If you open the official newspapers, watch the BBC or something, there's very little discussion of this group of people, very, very little discussion of them. And yet they find themselves, yet their day-to-day experience is this like transition to dependence. So when you find this kind of dramatic story anecdotally that you can kind of demonstrate with data is pretty widespread, and then you don't find it in the official narrative of the society, what you're looking at is disenfranchisement.
Yeah, I like that phrase you said, transition to dependence. Oh, I tried to quote it in the chat and I messed it up. I'll fix it. If I feel like if I quote you and have a misspelling when I quote you, it's almost like honoring you.
Yes. My Twitter feed famous for 3 or 4 typos per tweet.
Anyway, transition to dependence. That is a striking phrase. Okay, so I think that's mostly what we wanted to focus on from the article. I put the link to Margot's article in the live chat. Recommend you read the whole thing. Um, Morgauss articles are more than the sum of their parts. Reading the whole thing is a different experience than getting a quote or two. So I recommend it to you. Okay, so we looked at food bank usage. I'll flash that up on the screen one more time. So this is UK food bank, right?
Yep.
Okay, yeah. So UK food bank usage. Really, it's like the last 10 years that you really see a marked shift from before. But I don't know. You can see the trend even back. If all we had to look at, go back 10 years, all you had to look at was 2008 through 2011, those first four columns, first four sets of numbers. You'd go, this is going up. You might not expect what happens the next few years, right? Yeah. Where it goes up even more dramatically in 2012 through 2014. Just a tremendous increase.
I suspect this story is partly connected to the migration story in the UK.
Yeah.
But it's a tremendously complicated set of factors that put people in these positions. But it's just when you see anecdotal data of economic stress, this is an excellent proxy to look at to kind of figure out whether this is really going on.
Now, focusing on food prices specifically, this is a very interesting measure. It's share of disposable personal income spent on food in the United States. Have to be careful here because the last chart was showing about 15 years. This is showing 60 years. Yeah. So the portion we're interested in is sort of right at the end. What interests me here, and I'm reminded of Charles Murray's book, Losing Ground, where he showed that with the LBJ Great Society programs, a number of trends that had been going in a good direction either flatlined or suddenly started getting worse, right? So that's what really catches my attention. We'd sort of expect with a developing economy, economic productivity increases, we'd expect what we see in like the 60s and even the 70s and 80s, right? Which is that the amount of our income that we need to spend on food becomes less. Food production is becoming more efficient. Factory farming and all those evil things
yes
are producing food that maybe isn't good for us but is cheap. I'm not going to get in the nutrition argument, and sort of that's what you would expect, and then it kind of like flatlines almost 20 years ago.
Well,
and then it actually gets worse. It starts reversing direction. This is sort of a shocker.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is really interesting. So if you look at the period between sort of 1970 and about 1978, and just look at the history that's written about that period, it's written about as a period of pretty extreme economic stress, right? This is where we get the term stagflation from.
Yep.
You get a lot of political violence as a consequence of economic distress, or at least that's attributed to being a consequence of economic distress. And you're looking at a period where food prices, where as a share of disposable income, the cost of food, which is a very fundamental element of cost of living, basically stagnates. You see substantial progress in the past, and that progress stops. And that's
I see what you're saying.
That's one way of understanding the way that the 70s is thought of. Then you see
so that orange line at the top, it basically flatlines throughout the 70s, and then you start seeing it gently fall down again throughout the 80s and 90s.
You see a resumption of economic progress.
Yes. Right.
For households in the period between sort of 1980 and maybe 2002. But then you see a period between 2002 and maybe 2010, 2012, where you have the same kind of stagnation that you had in the 70s, but you don't have the same story about it at all, right? If you read the history of the period between 2002 and 2012, household economic stagnation is not typically part of that story, right? You'll hear about the Iraq War, you'll hear about Afghanistan. You'll hear about all kinds of other crap. You won't typically hear about household economic stagnation.
Mm.
And you have, in my view, this is the same kind of unacknowledged story. And then really from 2014 to 2022, you're looking at real decline in disposable income after fundamentals. In the food world, we'll see that the story is continued on the housing side. So you're looking at a pretty profound marker of economic stress there, particularly in the post-2020 world.
Yeah.
But the post-2020 trend, you can kind of, if you squint a little bit at it, you can kind of follow a trend line from 2010 through to 2012. So, I mean, 2020 obviously is a disruptive event, and we'll see how the trend looks on a longer period of time.
Mm-hmm.
But if you kind of blot out the 2020 event from the chart still kind of makes sense.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah. Orange line started 2010, sort of ignore the dip, and there's a sort of a line you could draw there.
Yeah,
that would mean that what we're at right now is kind of more or less on trend from the last 10 years.
Yeah, well, if you just kind of blot out 2020 as a weird outlier, because I think there's reasons to do that. You can see a trend line that's pretty negative.
Right. Which in this case means increasing shares of your personal income having to be spent on food.
Yep.
Rather than decreasing, which is what we've seen for large periods in the last 60 years. Okay, ready for the next one?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, so home price to median household income. So this is kind of a similar as the last chart in a way. It's trying to put this very important cost of living item in context with the income that people have, right? And so let's see, home price to median household income. So lower is better.
Yeah,
on this chart, right?
Lower means that as a fraction of your income, the cost of housing over time is going to be less. Now, there's a confounding factor here because many people borrow in order to buy houses. So interest rates are not included. This is not like a total cost of housing metric, but it's an important proxy if you have the interest rate environment kind of in the back of your mind. So you can see that in the period between, I guess that's 1960 at the start of the chart.
1955, yeah.
Yeah. And sort of 1970, a period of relatively stable interest rates. You have a declining ratio of household income to housing costs, which means that as a fraction of household income, less and less, actually quite dramatically less, is being used to pay for housing. You then have a pretty stable ratio basically from 1975 to 1990. During that period, there are wide vacillations in interest rates that really affect the perception of this ratio. But there's, I mean, it's kind of interesting that there's as much stability in the ratio as there is during that period.
More or less flat if you squint.
Yes. And then you have 1990 to 2008, where you have the great unwinding of interest rates, where interest rates basically go to zero forever after 2008. And so it kind of makes sense in an environment of declining interest rates that you would have higher home prices as a fraction of household income, because the mortgage costs are going to be declining. So there's some rationale for it, even if it's maybe not the best metric. And then you have what's really interesting, the period post 2020, which is a period of radically increasing interest rates. and a radically increasing ratio of house prices to household income.
Right. And I note that by this measure, at least, we've now exceeded the ratio that at the height of the housing bubble of 2006, 2007, except, well, you tell me, I think you probably watch the media more than I do, at
Yeah.
least the financial press. Are they talking about it like it's a 2007 housing bubble?
No, no.
Okay.
I mean,
I didn't think so, but I
there's
thought maybe I missed it, you know?
yeah, there's some discussion about distressed real estate markets, some
Hmm.
discussion about the divergence between mortgage costs and rent. So one of the things that's gone on in the last 24 months is that uh, mortgage costs have radically increased and rents have not radically increased, and a lot of that has
Hmm.
to do with the fact that it's extremely difficult to pass on rent increases in the face, especially if they would be higher than officially posted inflation numbers. So you have like a sticky price phenomenon, which is an interesting story in and of itself. Um, but certainly you don't have uh, this isn't there's no discussion like this is 2008 going on at the moment.
Yeah, which, well, that goes back to the earlier theme, right? It's happy talk being projected at us while our actual experience is not so happy.
Yeah, I mean, if you just go like housing costs, food costs as a percentage of household income,
Yeah.
um, you have a pretty ugly story here for the United States. Um,
Right.
so, uh, pretty dramatic and pretty ugly story.
Okay. So one last metric we're going to take a look at as we paint this somewhat bleak picture. Now, this is just, okay, this is new mortgage percentage rates,
Yep.
right? And they had reached what is that, about 20 plus year low
Yep.
a few years ago. And now they're heading back up to being as high as they were back in 2001 or whatever.
Yeah.
Right.
So what I wanted to draw attention to here is if we flip back to our previous chart and look at price ratios in 2001, you're looking at, with changes in rates, you're looking at housing that, in a comparable rate environment is twice as expensive in absolute terms. So in terms of cost for a new home buyer, you're looking at like
Oh,
2.5 times as much
okay.
cost
I think I'm getting
borne by a new home buyer as you would, in 2002.
right.
For
So 2001, 2002 rates with 2023 prices
That's
that are
correct.
twice as much. Yeah, yeah,
Yep.
gotcha. Right, right.
So when we're telling the story of like the fraction of the household budget that goes to paying for homes, prices and mortgage rates are going to be a leading indicator rather than the stats on percentage of disposable income spent,
Hmm.
because it takes time for old mortgages to roll off and people have to renew at higher rates.
Yeah, right, right, right.
So
Facing the young person, young family, whatever, trying to get their life started, buy a home, you want to look at something like this, right?
yeah, and you want to look at this because rather than the lagging indicator of what people are currently paying, because you want to
Hmm.
kind of look forward into, if things keep going as they're going, what's going to happen? Well, if
Yeah,
things
yeah,
keep going as they're going, and that housing is going to be a much more substantial fraction of the household budget. Um,
right.
so,
And anecdotally, I've been seeing people talking about how it's much harder to get into home ownership at this point. Yeah, young people, a lot more continuing to live with their parents. I don't know if there's probably stats on that, but anyway, anecdotally, hearing a lot more living with your parents, um, and it being harder to set up what we think of as sort of the normal household, right? We
yeah,
got
I mean,
married, we bought a house, we got a mortgage, we bought a house, bought our first house, right?
I mean, you could read hundreds of articles about the challenges in family formation and delayed marriage, delayed childbearing. This is definitely part of that story.
Yeah.
I tend to think that it's less part of the story than some of the
Yeah.
than the fact that it's kind of unfulfilled expectations. Like the psychological context here, I think, is really important when you're talking about family formation.
Yeah.
Because historically, people formed families in incredibly economically difficult
Yeah. Right.
circumstances.
Yeah. Yeah.
However,
But it's subjective, as we learned in Austrian economics. Your subjective perception of things is
yeah,
real from the point of view of economics. You know.
it radically influences your behavior, right?
Yes. Right.
The choice to delay family formation because of economic factors really depends a lot on your economic expectations.
Yeah, and I can't help but think, Black Horse. I guess I'm gonna make you an honorary member of the large family crew at this point. even though historically I'm not sure either of us would count. But anyway,
Yeah.
In that context, we talk about some of the things people say about having children. You know, because that's a conversation that comes up with us a lot. And one of the things people say is, I can't afford kids. We can't afford children, or we can't afford more children, right? As you said, historically speaking, step back, look at the big picture. You probably could afford more kids.
Yeah, you definitely can, like
Yeah,
100%.
right.
However,
but it's their perception that they would not be able to provide for 3 children the kind of life that they were thinking that they think they can provide for one, that would be sort of their picture of what they would provide for their children, right?
Yeah, well, and the other thing that's kind of always in the background of those conversations when particularly men say I couldn't afford more children is the specter of like what does it mean to fail to fulfill the economic expectations of your wife, right? um, in present context, I think there's a lot of men who think that if they fail to kind of meet the economic expectations of their wife, they're going to be, out on their ass, and their wife is going to be collecting 50% of their paycheck.
Right. There's a certain pressure.
So,
So okay, so let's be careful here. What overall are we saying? We don't expect mass starvation tomorrow.
Yeah.
Right. So let's keep it to some degree in perspective. Having said that, to understand how people behave economically, you do have to understand how things seem to them subjectively, right? Their expectations, and it is real when someone who had probably historically, by historically maybe, given the post World War II era in the West, maybe, then they had a reasonable expectation of what their life would look like as middle and lower middle class or something. And now they're slipping down a notch into needing assistance. And their parents and grandparents did not need assistance. This is not like a thing they know how to do or a thing that is just normal for their people, right? This is new and shocking.
Yep.
Right.
And you're seeing like a lot of the anecdotal signs you're seeing, I think, are legitimately connected to this broader economic story. What I think it's important to point out is that we're not looking at an acute story, we're looking at a chronic story. And in some sense, if we were looking at an acute story, the story might be a lot better, because you could imagine that, the period between 2020 and 2025 ended up being an outlier economically, and we went back to a different story. The fact that it's a chronic story, and that 2020 looks like the outlier and 2023 looks like it's on trend line, that's not a good thing.
Right. Yes, definitely. Going back to the food bank usage, right? I feel like it's most clear looking at that. We've got a big problem here.
Yeah.
By which I mean a long term. There's things going on that have been going on, and it's hard to imagine how this can be just easily turned around such that we're back to 25,000 people at the food bank instead of 3 million. Right?
Yeah, it would everything we've looked at here would suggest that you would need significant structural changes, changes that would be changes that might be common to a place like the UK and common to the United States in order to try to address the cost of living crisis. And that, the next bill coming out of the Biden White House is not likely to do it. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, right. Right. Or, all right, ready for me to pivot here to segue?
Yeah, sure.
Or the Fed is making a bit of a change here. So they had been very concerned. I think that's the official story, at least. They've been very concerned about rising price inflation. So they started raising the interest rate to address that price inflation before it would get out of control and lead to, at the worst, hyperinflation, right?
Yeah.
Sort of hard to imagine in the U.S., but it's possible.
Yeah.
So they were doing that. How long? I'm sorry.
They did that for about a year, starting sometime in 2022. But
I thought it was 2022, but I didn't remember how early in 2022. Sort of late 2022, I guess. Right?
It was the most aggressive campaign of raising interest rates since 1980, and on a relative basis, the most aggressive campaign of raising interest rates in U.S. history.
Oh wow! Okay.
So, if you look at the 1980 event as a percentage of rates at the start, 2022 is bigger. Because rates start at like 6% in 1980 and they go to 20%.
Yeah, that was insane. I remember. Right. So now they are, let's see.
So now they're doing
they haven't actually done it, if I'm reading this correctly. They're signaling that they're going to cut the rates.
Well, what they've done is they've stopped raising interest rates. So that's a major event, right? You have this most aggressive campaign in recent history of raising rates. That campaign is now over. So that in itself is a big time news story.
Right there. Yeah.
The other piece of big time news here is that the Fed is anticipating lowering rates in the future. Why is that news? Well, if we looked at a chart of long-term interest rates, a long-term chart of Fed funds rates, you'll notice it's always a step function downwards. So historically, rates drop very rapidly all at once in response to an economic crisis, almost always. And there's you could count on one hand the number of times in the last since 1970 where rates have gone down stepwise as a gentle adjustment. So they're suggesting that they're going to do something that they've almost never done before, and certainly something that they've never done since the 2001 event.
So lower interest rates from having spiked them up, but do it fairly gently. Is your point?
In a controlled manner instead of you look at the last 3 times; those are all crisis responses.
Yeah, they're freaking out, trying to prevent a complete economic meltdown.
Yeah. So I'm not sure exactly what to make of that story. Is it good or bad that the Fed is talking about a controlled decline in interest rates in advance without an economic crisis pending? I really have no idea whether that'll be good or bad, but it's definitely news. It's not happened in a very, very long time.
Okay, so I think
there's also the alternate interpretation that it's a signal that there actually is an economic crisis, right?
Oh, that they are starting to lower the rates. They're concerned about the crisis.
Yeah, so it's possible that what this actually signals is that they're preparing for a crisis response, right? So if you look at the rhetoric from the Fed in that if you look at the chart of Fed funds rate that's on the screen there, if you look at like 07, that flat line at the top, if you went and read Fed releases during that period, you would have seen a lot of rhetoric about like readjusting rates down to 3.5% or something in a controlled way to respond to difficult conditions in the housing market, and they don't actually do anything until they suddenly need to do it,
and then they drop it like
they drop the hammer, right? So there's a narrative here where usually when the Fed starts turning around, they're late, and the economic crisis that's going to force them to rapidly decrease rates has actually already happened and is just working through the market.
Right.
So I'm not saying that is the case in predictive mode. Don't go and sell all your stocks on my account, but there's definitely a narrative you could construct where that's the interpretation.
Okay, well, any other comments on that or prognostications? Well, it sounds like what you're saying is, this is interesting. This is a projection based on what?
That's based on the Fed's official guidance. So the Fed's official guidance always looks like this, where it's either a gentle upslope or a gentle downslope.
What they do, then reality is the last chart. Yeah. Wild swings up and down.
Yeah. So I always get a kick out of Fed projection charts because they're never right. But
they never match up to reality, right? Yeah. In particular, if we see a I'm sorry. This chart is actually good. Changes in core prices. So don't pay too much attention to the absolute values, but the shape might be right. Which is that we see price inflation spiking up, and then just in this last year, with them being aggressive, price increases have not been as high. There's still it's not at zero, right? It's still got inflation. It's just not up at that 5.5% level that started to get everybody nervous, right?
Yeah. Well, the Fed has an official policy targeting 2% inflation.
Yeah, right.
And
so from their point of view, that they're trending towards 2 means they're kind of on the way to where they want to be. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Madness. Okay. All right. Any other comments on the Fed or inflation?
Yeah, I just want to make sure people kind of have their eye on what's going on at the Fed and understand how unique it is. And the historical pattern of, when the Fed starts getting happy feet about things, you see the shape of the last 3 tops there. Are these lovely precipices where the Fed doesn't know what to do, and then crap. So
okay. So let me be very careful here, but if we were to see a shape like we saw in these last 3 episodes, we would see a drop, a precipitous drop in interest rate, probably in response to an economic crisis.
That's correct.
We're not saying that's what would happen, but that would certainly follow the pattern.
That would certainly follow the pattern. And if you extended that chart back to 1970, you'd find that pattern, at least since the early 90s, with the change to Greenspan.
It's pretty much that spike up and then drop down, sudden drop down. Yeah.
And particularly this pause at the top where the Fed stops knowing what to do. That's my favorite part of the pattern, right?
They're just like, we're just going to watch for a while, see where this goes.
Yes. So that's where you get that incredibly famous Jim Cramer clip from 2000. I think it's early 2008 or late 2007, where he's like goes hard against. He talks about the Fed as if they have no idea what's going on in the market. It's like the one correct Jim Cramer prediction is that the financial crisis is coming. He predicts it like 3 months in advance.
Yeah, and also just to connect up real quick before we wrap up to a theme we've covered now and again on this show. Notice how it flatlines at the bottom at essentially effectively zero Fed funds rate target. Well, now you might get an idea there why you'll hear crazy talk about negative interest rates, right?
Yeah, well,
Because they'd like to, if they could go below the axis line, they might like to do that, right?
yeah. Well, if you were to pair this chart with a chart of Fed balance sheet, that would be interesting as well, because along with the kind of unprecedented increase in rates, we've also seen the first meaningful contraction in Fed balance sheet in recorded history. So,
I'm sorry, when did it contract? Over what time period?
Between sort of mid 2022 and now.
Okay. Right. So both raising interest rates and contracting the balance sheet
Yes.
together. Right. All right. And so now everything's healthy and they can go back to pumping it up again, right? With the low interest rates.
Yeah. Well, everything's good now. No more inflation. Time to print more money. That sounds about right to me.
Get the party back going again.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks, Black Horse, very much. Here's the plan for the rest of the year, folks. I probably won't do a show next week or the week after, so I'll take a Christmas break for 2 weeks. Well, I'm sorry. No, the Christmas break is next week because on Christmas week, sometime between Christmas and New Year's, I need to line up some judges. We would usually have our art contest. And we will have our art contest. And this year we are doing album cover design. We've done currency design, flag design, vexillology, and it's always a great deal of fun. We have judges who just take it very seriously, and it's really fun to hear them make comments on the aesthetics of these things. And of course the entries are, whatever you think of them artistically, they're all done with a great sense of creativity and fun. So my favorites are not always the ones that the judges like. It's just one that I think is funny or done with great meme spirit, So looking forward to that. And I should make a note to myself, find judges. So we'll do that, and we'll be back with the mutual aid series and with Black Horse, alternating between the mutual aid series and talking with Black Horse about financial affairs at the beginning of the year. And we'll see what 2024 looks like, Black Horse. There's this feeling, and I see people saying it in our circles a lot. You just feel like something's coming, Now, maybe that means political turmoil that somehow isn't reflected in economics,
Yeah, one of the reasons
seems unlikely. But
one of the reasons why we chose the title "Decline is a Grind" is that in some ways I think the feeling that something is coming might be a reflection of hope, right? The extension of the current trend lines into the future is very uncomfortable. So in some sense, I think the desire for an acute crisis reflects a desire rather than something people genuinely know is coming, right? Because if there was an acute crisis, then maybe there'd be an opportunity to change course. Whereas if things just kind of grind on like this, then there's no political opportunity. And like the really ugly version of this story is a version of the story where there's declining standards of living for a long period of time with no political opportunity associated with that.
Yeah, right. Just a long, slow, what is it? Better to burn out than fade away. A long, slow fade away, right?
Yeah. Well, and that's really like when you look at the UK, that's the actual story of the last 15 years there, right? A substantial economic decline over a protracted period of time with no associated political opportunity at all.
No acute moment that sort of is a call to arms.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. just the general feeling of, wow, it's a little bit more shit than last year.
Than it was last year.
Right?
Every single year for a long time.
Okay. Well, thank you, sir. And thanks again to my friend Morgoth for his article. Once again, just want to really recommend his Substack to you if somehow you don't already read Morgoth. He has videos too where he basically reads essays and so forth. But he is, in my view, above all, a writer. And so Substack, I think, is really a good medium for him to shine at his best. You know, it's like kind of Substack is a platform made for Morgoth, in my view, where his talents can really come through. Yeah, he's called things like the poet of the North, which is funny because as far as I know, I've never seen him publish any poetry. But
Yes.
when you read his prose, you understand why they call him the poet of the North. He writes somehow in a poetic way, even though he writes in prose. So anyway, highly recommend my friend there, with complete honesty. He's not paying me for this. So, all right. See you guys at hopefully the art show right at the end of this year. Otherwise, have a Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and see you in 2024, where hopefully something will come along that will be surprising and exciting and good. Let's pray for it. Okay, thanks everyone. Bye.